Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's second main stage event on our second day of Upswell. We're just thrilled to have you joining us for this critically important conversation about the health of the nonprofit sector. Just to frame this a little bit, we at Independent Sector believe that all people need to thrive in the United States. And in order for that to be realized, we need to have a healthy and vibrant and just civil society. And we have a long history in which we can look to how American civil society has been an engine for people and environmental thriving. So that raises a critical question for us. How healthy, in fact, is American civil society? And that's the discussion that we're going to dive in today. A number of years ago, about four, Independent Sector, working with a group of academics and practitioners, began to really interrogate this question. Could we put together a report that would help the broad American population understand how well we're doing as a nonprofit sector? And I'm happy to say that report was just released, the second one, last week. And if you haven't taken a look at it, I'd really commend it to you. It's a collection of original and aggregated data from multiple sources to help really get at this question, to paint a picture of how healthy the sector is. So not surprisingly, 2020 was one of the toughest years probably of our lifetime. It also has extraordinary opportunities that have presented themselves. But as we approach the end of 2021, we want to look back and look at the sector. And we want to understand that the sector does, in fact, continue to face significant challenges, actually more acute than ever. There has been higher demand of services and needs drawn on the sector. We have fewer workers and volunteers to bring to bear in response, insufficient funding. And despite it all, there is this incredible drive that we all have to drive the common good, to build a strong and healthy and vibrant community so that all can thrive. So data is a powerful way to get at that. And today we're going to look at data. But equally important to data is what we understand by it. What does it mean? And how does the data and our sense making of it help us then drive action to driving a healthier and more just civil society? So we're going to have a phenomenal panel to kind of dig into that today. But before I do that, turn it over to our kind of experts, I'd like to just paint a little bit of a picture from the report. This is just a small snapshot of some of the important issues that I think the panel will then take up. So the overall data isn't surprising to any of you who are practitioners. The nonprofits across the country experienced dramatic shocks to their finances, to human capital, and to programming. A sizable portion of the sector showed an overall loss in revenue. Many organizations saw dramatic declines in fee-for-service, while others actually benefited from an increase in donations. And many organizations were forced to use reserves funds, if they had them, to make everything work at the end of the year. The sector also lost 1.6 million jobs, and it will be nearly a year still before we see a return to full employment. But there's also some good news. The nonprofits still succeeded in contributing to civil society and to our economy during the pandemic and recession. Though 40% of nonprofits reported serving fewer people last year, they still had significant reach. More than half of the people that we surveyed said that they received services from the sector. It's an extraordinary accomplishment when you think how large our nation is. In terms of advocacy and civic engagement, a group of organizations, including Independent Sector, were able to advocate for the Paycheck Protection Program and other supports that protected 4.1 million nonprofit jobs, helping to ensure the sector could provide services. And at the same time, many of those nonprofits played a critical role in increasing voter participation. More people in the U.S. reported their confidence in nonprofits as being strong and robust. And for the first time in years, our sector witnessed an increase of people donating. Huge breakthrough. But of all of our successes, our sector is not exempt from some disparities we see in many systems across our country. This session today is meant to delve a bit deeper into some of the data and hear from nonprofit leaders in the front lines about the extent to which the disparities reported in our 2021 report resonate with their experience over this past year. Again, to give you a high-level understanding of two areas we saw major disparities in 2020, in finances and human resources. First, finances. Overall, nonprofits suffered from a disruption of their programs and funding in 2020. 57% decreased, that is finances and programming. 57% of the nonprofits decreased overall expenses in 2020. 64% suspended or paused services at some point in 2020. 44% reduced the number of programs or services, and 47% served fewer people by the end of the year. In terms of disparities, arts and culture organizations were identified as the most financially vulnerable in 2020. Because of the impact of COVID-19, these organizations were hardest hit by declines in fee-for-services as compared to other types of organizations. Organizations that entered 2020 with a marginal organizational health, including finances, found it significantly more difficult to adapt to the rapidly changing environment. And those organizations facing these adaptive challenges happened to be smaller and led by and serving communities of color. Specifically, even before COVID-19, the budgets of nonprofits led by Black, Native, or people of color were 24% smaller than white-led nonprofits. Similarly, unrestricted assets of organizations led by Black, Native, or people of color were 76% smaller than those led by white people, making it exceedingly difficult to manage the adaptive challenges that they were facing. COVID-19 impact in 2020 was significant. 23% of philanthropic dollars were designated to communities of color. That's an increase, which was fantastic. However, when you exclude high net worth donors, and very specifically someone like McKinsey Scott, the portion of that drops to 13%. Nonprofit finances in 2020 are also directly related to the well-being of the workforce. Overall, human capital in the nonprofit sector took a significant hit in 2020, as many nonprofits were forced to lay off employees and suspend volunteer programs. The sector initially lost 1.6 million jobs due to COVID-19. And although 1 million jobs have come back, mercifully, experts estimate the sector will not return to pre-COVID-19 employment levels until July of 2022. In the area of human resources, we also saw great disparities. The sector grew less diverse. So I want to stop and the sector grew less diverse, possibly due to how women who make up the majority of nonprofit staff and Black, Native, and other employees of color experienced additional barriers to returning to work during the pandemic. So we have a lot to chew on, and I want to turn now to our panel. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Stacy Palmer, editor of the Chronicle of Philanthropy, whom is a veteran of Upswell and should be familiar to many of you. Elisha Rhodes, interim CEO of the YMCA, and Ekundayo Bandele, founder and CEO of Hadaloo Theater, a Black repertoire theater in Memphis, Tennessee. So I want to just bring them on and say how delighted we are to have all of them, Stacy, Elisha, and Ekundayo. Welcome, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Stacy.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Dan. And what a powerful set of data. And given how we follow data closely, I have to say it's quite an accomplishment to be able to pull that together, because there's such a paucity of information, especially real-time information about what's going on. And that is what actually really excites me about being able to talk today to two extraordinary leaders who will tell you a lot about what has been going on from their perspective. I'm going to talk a lot about what has been happening in these past 18 months with you. We'll talk about how your mission has changed, your staff has changed, your finances, your board members, and really what's changed for you as leaders. We'll talk, too, about what's important going forward. What is it that needs to be done to change the trajectory of some of the things we just heard about? So I hope you'll be open with the kinds of things that you think would make a difference going forward. I would love to start by talking about those numbers a bit. And I'm going to start with you, Ekundayo. As you listened to Dan give those numbers, what surprised you about what you heard?
Well, the sad thing is nothing surprised me. We've been living with that disparity and that inequity since founding Hattie Lou Theater in 2006. Those numbers are just reflective of the environment in which nonprofits that are led by people of color and women, especially, that we have been trying to thrive in for all of these years. Is kind of trying to squeeze $1 out of 5 cents. We've become somewhat adept at doing it, but that is definitely at the expense of the people that we are serving. And so those numbers that Dan gave, I mean, they're not at all surprising to me. Indeed, they're just affirmative.
Indeed. And some people may not know about the theater you run. It's one of 7 Black theaters, I believe, right? Could you tell us a little bit about it so that people know what you're talking about throughout the rest of the conversation?
So, Hattie Lou, we're not one of 7 Black theaters. We're one of 7 independently Black-owned theaters. So what that means is that there are only 7 Black theaters in the entire country that own their own space. That's it, 7. Right? And I mean, prior to 2 years ago, there were only 4. So Hattie Lou, we constructed a new space. We did a $4.3 million campaign in between 2013 and 2014. And we constructed a 14,000 square foot building in what is known as the Theater District, or Overton Square, in Memphis, Tennessee. We were founded in 2006, and our mission is very simple. It is to develop a Black theater that is accessible to, relevant to, and reflective of a multicultural community. And the significance of Hattie Lou being in Memphis, we are in the Mid-South region, and we're in a city that's 64% African American. And prior to Hattie Lou, there was no cultural evidence that Black people lived in Memphis. That's in a city that's 64% Black. We weren't bringing anything to the cultural table of this city, this county, nor this region, the Mid-South region. And so right now, Hattie Lou grew from a $40,000 budget in 2006 when we were founded to a $1.7 million budget currently. And the beautiful thing is we have Hattie Lou Theater, our main location. We have a technical theater center, and we have an apartment house that we call Hattie House, and we have no debt on any of our structures. So we're very proud about our fiscal prudence.
Congratulations on that. We are going to talk more about finances, not surprisingly, in this conversation. Elisha, I think probably people know the why better, but you can talk to us a little bit about your organization. But I'm curious, what is it that, as you were listening to what Dan was saying, did you find any surprises? And what do you see as key takeaways from what this data shows us?
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us here with you. Thank you, Ekundayo, and thank you, Stacy. Thank you, Dan. So just a minor correction before we go any further. Dan knows the organization very intimately, but like so many that come, they confuse us with the YMCA. So just a correction, we are the YWCA. And we operate at the intersection of gender and race. So you can find us in over 1,200 communities. You can find us in over 200 local associations across the country, in 45 states, plus the District of Columbia. And you can find us doing whatever it takes to uplift the most marginalized in those communities. YWCA is also an organization out of the 200 plus associations that we have. 140 of them provide gender-based violence services, which we also know as domestic violence and sexual violence services. So we are the largest provider of DV services across the country. And as you mentioned, Stacy, the data that Dan, so eloquently lifted up in the report, and we're extremely grateful that the report is actually there, because we believe at YWCA that in order to make decisions and to move forward, we need data. So I just want to acknowledge the importance of capturing and analyzing data as we think about how we move forward. However, as Ekundayo said, there's really nothing surprising. I think that what really the feeling and the emotion that I had beyond surprise was sad, right? That in 2021, the data, while it may have been exacerbated by the impact of the pandemic, still very much represents the sector as we know it. So there was really nothing that was extremely surprising. It actually was pretty saddening that we are still struggling with some of the same systemic barriers that we have been for many, many, many years.
One of the things in the data that is certainly not a surprise is that the small organizations were hit the hardest. Arts organizations were hit the hardest. Ekundayo, I know you probably feel it very much so. I'm curious what you saw your peers going through, and did the racial protests change anything in terms of money flowing in, support? Was there anything positive or negative that changed for you as a result of what we saw over the past few months?
Well, there's that old saying, when white America gets a cold, Black America gets pneumonia. And that's pretty much what happened within my field. Not to speak on every Black theater and every Black theater company in this country, the ones that I was in communication with, we all had pneumonia. We all felt the same. And what that meant was we had to close our doors. We make our living, or part of our living, from selling tickets and subscriptions to individuals to come see our shows. But a part of earned revenue that a lot of people didn't see was, especially for those who have their own spaces, also losing rentals, gift shop sales, concession sales. And another thing, being in a nonprofit, when you have a play, ticket sales aren't going to cover the expenses of a performance. And so you have sponsors. But when you don't have a product, when you don't have a play, when you don't have a program, then you really don't have anything to offer to sponsors. And so many of the Black organizations, again, that I was in contact with, not to speak of the macrocosmic field, but the microcosmic field, we really did hurt when we had to close our doors. And when you talk about the racial justice and social justice movement that swept across the country, there was a movement within theater that started that was called We See You White American Theater. And so from that, a result was you saw people of color entering into seats of leadership in some of America's largest white theaters. And you have 74 LORT theaters, which are League of Resident Theaters. And I think you have around 3 or 4 African Americans who are now leading those theaters, which is unprecedented. Right. And then you had a fund called the Black Seed Fund, which was created to support Black theaters specifically. Not just theaters of color, but Black theaters. And so that is a result of the inequity that Black theaters have been experiencing for so long. Now, if you're talking about, has there been a huge swell and flood of support coming to Black theaters based on, or rather riding the heels on all of the injustices and inequities that we've been seeing over these past few years? The answer is no. There has been a lot of conversation and there has been articles written. However, if you're asking if there's a lot of money that is rising the tide so that Black theaters can compete with their white counterparts, I haven't seen it. But I have seen a lot of conversation and a lot of articles published around that.
Yes, I think many of us have been trying to track where is the money coming and going and what's happening to it, which, again, it gets to some of these data questions as well. But it's really interesting to hear what you see on the ground. Elisha, I'd like to ask you, the YWCA, there's such a difference in the kinds of organizations where you operate across the country. What have you seen? Has it been that same uneven picture where large organizations are doing better than small organizations? Or how has it played out, would you say, among your affiliates?
Yeah, so our network, as I mentioned, very broad, but all operating at the center of gender and racial equity. So while programming may look differently for communities that we serve, at the end of the day, all of our intention, all of our resources are really bubble up to just dismantling all systemic barriers around gender and racial equity. I think that the thing that just burdens me the most is that people of color-led nonprofits always tend to be the smaller nonprofits, right? And the smaller organizations. And they're also, before COVID, they were the less resourced organizations. They were typically the organizations that you can find in communities. And before COVID, they faced more challenges than organizations that were white-led and are white-led. So even before COVID or post-COVID, the struggle always has been that, smaller organizations are really suffering as we think about how resources are allocated. And surprise, surprise, the smaller organizations, for the most part, are led by people of color. So throughout the COVID pandemic, and when we think about how we move forward, I think that we can talk about the exacerbation that COVID has on the sector, but I would challenge us to go beyond the unfortunate increase in lack of services, lack of funding for community-based organizations or smaller organizations, and really center our attention on the systemic issues and impact, right, that already post-COVID or pre-COVID, sorry, not post, pre-COVID, had these smaller organizations that were so intimate and so trusted by the community and led by people of color already operating at a deficit. And then you couple that with the anti-Black racism and the hate and all of the brutality and the deaths that we've seen during the pandemic. And then you couple it with the many shadow pandemics that we lift up as a result of the pandemic. It's almost like you were already operating at a deficit and now you are negative. So I would say that, yes, absolutely. Our smaller organizations in our network, they tend to struggle more for resources. And we do our best at YWCA USA to fill the gap and the void, particularly with COVID. But this is not new because of COVID. This has been a systemic issue within the sector before COVID, pre-COVID.
A lot of these things have been going on for a long time. I am curious, your organization was one of the beneficiaries of Mackenzie Scott's gift. She did aim a lot of them at organizations led by people of color. Is that changing things? Is that changing the talk with donors, the ability to do things? How transformative is that kind of a donation?
Yeah, first of all, just thank you immensely and sincerely to Mackenzie Scott for centering the organizations that she has, and not only the organizations, but the institutions, the HBCUs and other organizations that really have been ignored before COVID. So we want to just first, before we go any further, I personally want to thank Mackenzie Scott and the entire community surrounding her for providing such a relief. To your question, Stacy, does it make a difference and is it changing the landscape for us? It certainly has made a difference in the associations that received the donation. But it's important to note that while it has made a difference, right, we have 200 plus local associations, not even half of those associations were able to receive a donation, not because Scott probably didn't want to, but because there is an unmet need that, for the most part, sometimes outrun the available resources, right? So as the associations that have received the Scott donation, it's the doors remain open for a longer period of time. We can provide the critical services to local associations, to communities that actually need us. Our frontline workers, right? We know typically come from those marginalized lower income communities, and YWCA is the community organization that provides childcare. So yes, we were able to provide, and we still are able to provide childcare services for our frontline workers and first responders. So we are extremely grateful for the support of Mackenzie Scott. We are also really grateful for the support of all of our partners and all of the corporations that have stepped up and not only publicly announce their commitment to the nonprofit sector and the racial justice sector, but have delivered on the things that they publicly committed, right? Because that's a totally different session that I don't want to take us down that road. But for those corporations and foundations that not only declared their commitment, but absolutely stepped up and funded their commitment and showed up for our communities, we are extremely grateful, and it helps us move forward and it helps us provide the resources. But know that we are still operating at a significant deficit in the communities that need us the most.
And that worries us all greatly about that problem. And I'm wondering, is it exacerbated too? We've seen this dramatic drop in middle class donors. As the wealthy have grown wealthier, they're certainly giving generously, but at all organizations, that disappearance of middle-class donors, I'm curious how that plays out for each of your organizations. Ekundayo, I'm going to start with you.
Mm-hmm. Well, at the end of the day, Black people have not had the long road to create generational wealth. And a lot of philanthropy comes through generational wealth. It comes from parents, or rather children, seeing parents support nonprofits within the community. So when you look at the Black community, most of those philanthropic dollars go to churches, or they go to organizations like St. Jude, right? And that makes sense because those are the most visible. But when you're talking about small and mid-sized arts organizations, it's not even David versus Goliath. We don't even have a slingshot or a rock. And so when you look at those middle-class families within the Black community, and also the white community and other allies who support organizations of color, you're right, they are shrinking. And you have to, especially coming out of COVID, right, you have to make a decision on, groceries have gone up. So therefore, am I going to make this donation to this cultural institution, or am I going to buy these groceries? My car note is due, and so on and so forth. And so middle class families have to make those hard decisions. And at the same time, you look at those behemoth organizations, you look at those cultural institutions that are large and that have been around for 40, 50, 100 years, and you think that, okay, my $500, my $1,000 is going to be better suited with that organization instead of this Black theater over there. And that is because of what I'm calling cultural gentrification. Because you have the foundations and you have the donors saying, we want to see you become more diverse. And so these theaters who have never done a Black play, who have never gone into Black communities, all of a sudden they do it. And so you look at a Black family, a middle-class Black family or a middle-class family, and they say, I want my dollars to make an impact. And so this large historical organization over here, they have a $10 million budget, when this little Black theater over here has a $1.7 million budget. And so in the time of COVID-19, when you want your dollar to stretch further, you're going to take your dollars from that small, mid-sized organization, and you're going to give it to that larger organization. And so we lose risk capital, and we find ourselves, just like Elisha said, going into debt. And so definitely the middle class pull dollars from mid-sized and smaller organizations, and those larger organizations benefit from it because of gentrification.
Indeed. Elisha, how do you see it playing out? Are middle class donors pulling back from your organization as well?
You know, I really struggle with that. In full transparency and vulnerability, you know, why is the burden on middle class America, right? Why focus on middle class America when we have not even really, in my opinion, really define what middle class America really truly looks like? Like, it is you could be in it one day and out the next day, right? And within what we consider middle class America, there is still a significant struggle to keep food on the table consistently, right? To be there for your kids, to have accessible and affordable childcare, and you're part of middle class America, right? So before I can evaluate how middle class America has not shown up for nonprofits, I would also say that middle class America is part of the population that we serve. We seem to think that the services that are provided by nonprofit organizations are only for the folks that are deeply marginalized. Middle class America is also part of the marginalized group, right? So to have middle class America hold any burden for donations, I think is something that we probably need to reevaluate as a sector, and reevaluate the structure and the systemic barriers that continue to show up, that you're asking sometimes the folks in need to give more, right? As opposed to creating equitable situations where we can all thrive. You're asking the folks that are sometimes like trying to make really hard decisions about daycare, about health insurance, about do I still have to go to work and take the toxic environment, right, that is perpetuated at my job because I want to remain middle class America. So that's kind of, Stacy, what I would challenge us to kind of look at. But to answer your question, we've been extremely fortunate that we've received a significant amount of our continued funding from corporations and foundations, et cetera. So we don't necessarily think about whether or not middle class America is showing up for us. We think about how can we also show up for middle class America, because middle class America is not exempt from the struggles that we see because of the systemic barriers that we continue to perpetuate and that are exacerbated because of COVID.
Thank you. That was a fantastic perspective. I've talked a lot about individual donors, and what I'm also curious about is government and how much of a help it has been to you and your organizations during this tough period. Ekundayo, let me start with you. Am I right that you received a paycheck protection loan or applied for one?
Yeah, we received 2 PPP loans. Thank you, government. And we also received the shuttered venues operation. And even though we had to greatly reduce our staff to make certain that we stayed within a healthy fiscal environment, those dollars enabled us to keep the people who were critical for us to keep, so that we could serve the community in a digital format and make certain that our donors and our corporate partners saw an impact that we continue to make. And so government funding is important, as is the National Endowment of the Arts. We have received dollars from them as well. But I have to say locally, the Shelby County government and the Memphis City government have also been very supportive of Hattie Lou Theater during this period. And so government support really made a difference.
Can you talk a little bit more about what you did to transform how your organization operates as you had to make those decisions about staff? You really changed how you do what you do for a good chunk of time, didn't you?
Oh, yeah. Pre-COVID, we had 15 full-time employees and 3 part-time employees. Back March last year, we dropped that down to 4. And then I think it came around August, we dropped that down to 3. Now, we caught some flack for that, right? We had to keep those 3 people employed, and that did not include me. So with me, that was 4. But we had to keep those people employed. And here's one of my responses to that. Then I have to give a little addendum. But my response is our mission is to create a voice, to give a voice for people to express what they're feeling, be that joy or pain or frustration or whatever it is, and to be able to put that within a theatrical scope. All right. We're not Job Corps. Now, some people didn't like that. So we don't exist solely to keep people employed. That is not our mission. And our foundations and our corporations and our individual donors, they look to me as the founder and CEO to make certain that I don't mission creep, that I focus on why this organization was founded in 2006. Now, here's the addendum. While we were doing all of those digital things, we had to bring in designers, we had to bring in techies, we had to bring in actors, we had to bring in musicians and directors. All of them continued to get paid through our programming. So while they weren't part of our full-time staff, we did continue to support them. And so those were some of the hard decisions that we had to make. Just today, we hired a new person. So we're beginning to bring that staff back. But at the end of the day, it wasn't just about staying open from March to April to June and so on and so forth. It was also making certain that we had enough money in the coffers to reopen when we were able to put shows back on stage and to put programs back into communities.
And congratulations on having a new staffer join today. That's good news. Elisha, I want to turn to you and ask, what kind of government support did you have? What difference did it make?
Yeah, again, similar to Mackenzie Scott, just huge shout out to the government, the federal government, for the American Rescue Plan. We were able to, a lot of our local associations were able to benefit from many of the programs within the ARP, including the Paycheck Protection Plan, and also some of the loan programs within the SBA loan package. Right. So we were able, and thanks, we had to take all avenues to keep our doors open, whether it was corporation foundations and also the federal government coming in and, really in the clutch moments where, a lot of our local associations were like, well, we don't know if we're going to be able to make payroll if we can keep the lights on. And if they didn't keep the lights on, where are these women, right, going to go for DV services when first responders had to go to work? Where are their kids going to go if we didn't have emergency daycare? So keeping the lights on was critically important for our local associations. And the federal packages that were released were of great benefit. Now, do I say, yeah, we need more? Yes. Right? Absolutely. It is a beginning. I'm very grateful for what we have, even as we think about the child tax credit and the programs that continue to roll out. I think that the federal government definitely showed up in ways for our communities and for our local associations. But Stacy, I would be extremely remiss in this moment in time to talk about, look at where we are with infrastructure. Right? It's like we take a couple of steps forward, we give relief and we give support, but we can't see it through. Right? Infrastructure that includes childcare. So while we are extremely grateful for what federal programs have been able to do for us in our communities, we absolutely need the federal government to step up and show leadership, not for the 10 percenters of America, but for every single person, right? Because that is what we put them in office to do. So we appreciate what they brought to the table, and we are very, very much looking forward and heavily advocating for the increase in ongoing support to make sure that our communities can move from surviving to thriving.
And can you talk a little bit more specifically about what you're seeing? I mean, one of the things that Dan mentioned in the statistics is how many people have been helped by nonprofits. But then the question is, who's left out? What are some of the services, the things that you're seeing on the ground that people aren't getting? And especially, what are you looking ahead to as some federal aid has dried up? What are you seeing in communities across the country?
About who's left out? Black, Indigenous people of color are left out even more than they were pre-COVID, right? Then there's also the white community that live in rural America, right? That low-income white community that's also left out. So the same folks that were left out before COVID are the folks that continue to be left out in a more dramatic and drastic and impactful way, negatively impacting their lives and their abilities to care for their families. So, I often tell folks that there's not a lot other than the deaths, unfortunately, that we've had to go through, and we've lost our family members, we've lost our community members, we've lost our colleagues, unfortunately, because of COVID. But outside of that, these issues that we talk about now, about who's being left out or where are the resources going or who's funding and who's not funding, these aren't new issues. Right. This is the life that we've been living in 2012 and beyond, in 2020, 2019 and beyond. So the same folks that were left out before COVID are the same folks that continue to be left out. It just means that they're going to have a harder time getting back on their feet. And we're going to have a harder time raising the revenue to generate the resources to get folks back on their feet. And our job is not to get folks on their feet. Our job is to put folks in a position that they can own their lives and thrive, not just survive.
I'm really glad you underscored that. The other people who
can I say one more thing? I just absolutely have to acknowledge the LGBTQ plus community, right? Because I've gotten through, unfortunately, probably 20 minutes of this conversation without also centering that marginalized group that continues to be left out and continues to be ignored, and sometimes is not part of the conversations that we have. So thank you so much to Renee Golden for making sure that we signal the alarm for the LGBTQ plus community, particularly the trans community that we seem to think isn't part of any community at all.
I'm so glad you added that.
And if I could piggyback on that,
go ahead.
Quick, because I have a daughter with cerebral palsy, and the differently able community also is hardly ever mentioned in these conversations, and they are looked at as if we are that they can't fully participate. And I have a 26-year-old daughter who is differently abled and who is she's attending seminary. And so I also, advocate on her and her friends and her community as well.
Thank you. And part of what we were talking about is helping people thrive. The people who have really been challenged in thriving aren't just the people you all serve, but the people who work at your organizations. I mean, we've seen tremendous stress on nonprofit workers of all kinds. Obviously, people go into this profession because they want to serve others, but they have been on call in tremendous ways. And we've especially seen the mental health stress on many nonprofit folks. I'm curious how you're seeing that, and also whether you are starting to see signs that people may want to leave the field. We've all seen these talks about the big quit. And I wonder what you're each seeing at your organization. Elisha, let me start with you, and then I'll go to you, Ekundayo.
Oh, no. Me first? I have so much emotions. I was hoping to get in check on. So you, all right, I got it. So as that's real. We have, and I'll speak for myself personally. Before I even got on this, I think I probably had this morning a mild anxiety attack. And also I continue to try to figure out how do I need to show up, and the stress and the burden. So I would say that the mental health piece is definitely a piece that we need to normalize conversations around, and that we continue to take a toll. We are service providers, but we're also survivors ourselves, right? We provide services for communities, but we're also part of that community. So I know we're running out of time, and I will pass the rest of our time over to Ekundayo.
I have a very practical response to that. I can't find a lighting designer. It is so hard for me to find a lighting designer. Why? Because many of them had to go somewhere during COVID and get a job at a university or get a job at a business that deals with lighting. And so it's very difficult for me to find designers and some directors as well.
And so what are some of the solutions? Could each of you tell me what are you doing with your staffs to keep them motivated? Are there any kinds of things that you are able to do? Ekundayo, do you want to go first?
Yeah, and so we have just continued something that we've had for a while, and that is on every Tuesday and Thursday, we have an involuntary empathy hour. And what that empathy hour is that you come here to Hattie Lou and you sit down. Hattie Lou provides breakfast, and from 8 till 9 a.m., you don't talk about work. You talk about maybe something that you saw last night or something that you're going through or whatever. And what that means is, like, for instance, I have a new puppy, right? And so, of course, you know, he's crying and he's doing this and he's getting me up and blah, 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 blah. And so I may come in tired. And I can talk about that during my empathy hour. Therefore, if I'm grumpy somewhere, you know, down the day, then my staff can be like, oh, he's just grumpy because, you know, he was up with Tutmos all night and blah, blah, blah. And so those are some things we were already doing, making certain that we were in tune with one another and acknowledging the fact that we have a life outside of Hattie Lou and how those things that we experience outside of Hattie Lou affects what we're doing in Hattie
Lou. Elisha, are there steps that the YWCA has taken?
Absolutely. So I think the important thing that I'm just going to lift up in this moment is that sometimes we neglect to ignore that the people that come to work with us are also part of the groups, the marginalized groups that continue to suffer. The folks that we ask and we demand that they hold the work and space for the work are also the folks that are harmed by the practices within our communities. So when we think about mental health and we think about, well, what are we doing in the workplace? We say, well, let's have like conversations. And I'm not talking about the conversations and the empathy hour that Ekundayo is going to invite me to next time around, because I want to come to that empathy hour. But I'm talking about when things like the racial unrest happened with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, et cetera, and the uprising and everything really kind of hit, the folks that we've been asking to hold that space and to find solutions have been people of color, particularly Black folks. right? Which is a different toll and continue perpetuating the harm on folks. I've said several times to my staff, take time off, take time off, take time off. But when you come to work in the social justice space, you feel a certain sense of responsibility, even though you are also part of the group that is being harmed. So what I realized that I had to do was to close the office. Right? Because you're not going to take time off because you care about your coworkers. We care about each other. We don't want to leave, right? Our fellow coworkers, like out there trying to execute work. We are going to go on vacation, but we're still going to be checking emails, or we're going to take a day off and we're still going to be heavily invested. So it was really important for me to just have every other Friday off. The office is closed. Right? Because we're well-intentioned, we want to be there, but I needed to be a little bit more forceful in the time that I needed them to take for themselves. And, every other Friday, I would say, do something that makes you happy. It doesn't matter if you sleep all day. It doesn't matter if you spend time with your kids, whatever makes you happy, but making sure that we were all disconnected. Right? And not impeding on each other's time, or someone being off and thinking that they're missing something, to me has been, and what I've heard from my colleagues, have been really meaningful. So I would say not only giving folks the time off, but making sure that you sometimes close the office because people have a hard time disconnecting. And then if we're going to have these conversations, the last thing I would say, is that if we're going to have these conversations and that we're going to do this work together, make sure that we create spaces like healing circles at work, right? Where after you've asked a person to participate in the problem solving, particularly the problems that they experience on a day-to-day basis, you don't say, go right back to work. Where is that project, right? Or where are you with whatever you asked for yesterday, that you also create and you give folks space, time to heal. So center healing in our work, in our practices, how we show up for each other as a community.
That's tremendous advice. Thank you. Ekundayo, I'd love to hear from you about, and I'm going to ask you the same question, Elisha, but I'm giving you more warning this time after I did last time. I want to know how your leadership has changed. What are the things that came out of this that you are proudest of and that you will keep with you and that will help going forward?
I'm trying to think. The stupidest thing is I cook more and bring, stuff to the staff because during COVID I started cooking more. I honestly would say that I think I've become more pensive and listening. I've become more available. I've become a lot more flexible. I know that because the individuals who continued to work here, they had to be flexible, and I had to be more appreciative regarding their flexibility. And so I shut up a lot and I listen, and I appreciate the fact that I hired them because of their expertise, and that a lot of times I need to take the back seat. They brought their expertise to bear during this time. Taught me things that I had absolutely no knowledge about, right? And so it was important for me to acknowledge their wisdom, their knowledge, their strengths, and to give way to it. And when we were in the thick of things pre-COVID, we had such a large staff. It was, okay, let's do this, let's do that, let's do this. It was very difficult to sometimes be flexible. And during that period of shutdown, I really became a lot more flexible.
Excellent. Elisha?
For me, at first, it was really hard just seeing what was happening in just like my community, seeing what was happening with my colleagues at work, and just being in this quarantine period where I had, for the first time in a really long time, a moment to reflect on what is my contribution, what am I doing, am I perpetuating cycles by the way I show up or not show up. And I would be, I'm being completely honest and vulnerable, but what has changed for me is, like one of the greatest poets to ever walk this earth, and I'm being biased, maybe Audre Lorde said, your silence will not protect you. Right. And having that moment personally to really acknowledge and look at this is what happens when you're silent, and this is what happens when you speak up. Now figuring out where I wanted to stand in this moment, right? What I wanted to risk in this moment was something that definitely came out of and continues to come out of this moment. So I would say overwhelmingly, I am definitely a braver person. Because I truly believe that, damn it, if you're silent, it's not going to protect me. And it certainly is not going to help me accomplish the things that wake me up in the morning and bring me to the social justice sector. So bravery is something that I have kind of settled into. And I think lastly, I'm going to shave off less of myself. To be accepted by folks in the sector or personal life or whatever, any sector. I've decided to give up less of myself because I'm exhausted. I'm really, really, really exhausted.
And I really appreciate the word brave that you just used, because I think the two of you have shown exactly what kind of leadership we all need. You've been courageous in really unbelievable circumstances, as have all the people in this audience. And so we have such gratitude for the work that all of you have done in the audience. But what a treat to talk to you, Ekundayo and Elisha. We wish you the best of luck with your work going forward. I hope a year from now we have better stories to tell about the picture for all of us. And thank you very much for all of your comments today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Elisha, Ekundayo, and Stacy, thank you on behalf of independent sector and the Upswell community. We take very seriously this notion of data is part of the story, but the reflection through the work and lived experience everyone has. And you just brought that to life in a really powerful way. So I'm just deeply grateful for your individual and then the collective leadership. And Stacy, as always, your thoughtfulness in being holding the perch you do on the sector and raising these issues is just fantastic. So for those of you who are hanging in there with us, thank you. We're delighted. You have a whole series of extraordinary workshops and spark talks and deep dives between now and 4:30, and we hope you take full advantage of it. At 4:30, we'll be back here on the main stage with two just tremendous conversations. The first is to really celebrate the 2021 winner of the American Express NGen Leadership Award, Maria Yuan, who's just amazing. And then I'll be joining Nanoko Sato and Representative Betty McCollum to discuss an exciting and critical effort to ensure nonprofits have a voice at the table in shaping the administration's agenda moving forward. So with that, thank you very, very much. We look forward to seeing you soon. And again, a heartfelt gratitude to Elisha, Ekundayo, and Stacy.